Hey, good
And we
morning,
should be on.
everybody. Again, welcome back. It's Rob Perani, the director of the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program here at the Hudson River Foundation. I'm really pleased to be joined by a great panel on centering the community in habitat enhancement projects. Where the panel is going to be moderated by Ernest Hollerson, and I'm proud to say Ernest is a board member here at the Hudson River Foundation. He's also the board chair at Riverkeeper and has had a distinguished career working in environmental grant making and government leadership in New York City. So let me turn it over to Ernest, who will kick off our panel.
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks for the generous introduction. I think, as all of us know, access to nature is distributed inequitably throughout the region. And when I say the region, I don't only mean the sort of New York, New Jersey, Hudson Harbor and associated tributaries, but I would apply that to at least, the estuary from Albany, Troy, all the way to the tip of Manhattan. So in any case, advancing restoration projects in low-income, low-wealth communities can begin to chip away at this injustice and imbalance. Centering the community and habitat enhancement projects requires active listening, valuing community benefits and funding and planning decisions. Obviously, pilot projects, small-scale community-led projects can help in sort of guiding us to pulling off the larger projects in a way that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, throughout the country and in our region, there'll be more money around because of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, Justice 40, the Bond Act, which passed in New York State, the Green Bond Act, $4.2 billion. So there's a lot. There should be a lot to work with. A word about our format this morning. Each of our 5 panelists will make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. After that, I'll ask our panelists a round of questions. Then we'll give each panelist a chance to ask a question of another panelist. And then we'll open the question time to folks in the audience. And again, thank you for being here this morning. And our panelists are Arif Ullah, Executive Director, South Bronx Unite; Willis Elkins, Newtown Creek Alliance, Executive Director; Jamie Young, New York City's Department of Parks and Recreation, Environmental Protection Project Manager; Allison Fitzgerald, New Jersey University, an Associate Professor; and Leslie Craig from NOAA, the NOAA Restoration Center, Supervisor for the Southeast region. I'm not going to go deeper into their bios. You can find that information pretty easily. And I want to get to the sort of opening thoughts and presentations straight away. So Arif, over to you.
Thank you so much, and I'm very much glad to be part of this panel and looking forward to learning from my co-panelists as well. My name again is Arif Ullah, and let me just give you a background on South Bronx Unite as well as the South Bronx, just as a way of offering context for the topic of this discussion. So South Bronx Unite works with neighborhood residents, community organizations, and academic institutions to advocate for equity and justice for the Mott Haven and Port Morris sections of the South Bronx. Environmental justice and as related health equity are 2 of the main threads that run through all of our work. On that note, it's important to share that the South Bronx is New York City's epicenter for environmental injustice, and that's just something sad to share for us. And generations of people of color have been overburdened with environmental pollution, including a disproportionate number of waste transfer stations, peak power plants, expressways, heavy manufacturing, and diesel truck intensive operations, shipping operations. So sadly, you name it in terms of polluting facilities, we have it. And at the same time, the area has among the lowest access to green space per capita in the entire city. There's only 1 real green space for 60,000 people. So this reality, along with the cumulative impacts of pollution and poverty, has resulted in alarmingly high asthma rates. So children in the Bronx are twice as likely to be hospitalized for asthma and more likely to die of asthma than children in other parts of the country. And other air pollution related illnesses include infant mortality, cognitive impairment, diabetes, heart disease, and dementia. And just a few weeks ago, I read that there was a report published in the Lancet Journal that showed that unborn babies were shown to have PM 2.5 in their brains, lungs, and liver, which is just really tragic. And so with the onset of the effects of climate change, from extreme storm-related flooding to the urban heat island effect, the quality of life for community residents is worsening. Next slide, please. So one way we're addressing the injustices that I just described is through a waterfront plan. In collaboration with our community residents, we created a plan for an interconnected network of green spaces on the waterfront. These spaces would provide some relief from the toxic air and also contribute to better mental health. We also believe that the creation of these green spaces will inevitably improve the stewardship of the adjacent waterways and contribute to habitat restoration and enhancement. But I want to be clear that our primary concern is the health of community residents for all of the reasons that I just mentioned, for the decades of environmental racism, public policies that really decimated our community and community members' health. But we don't see the health of community residents as separate from the well-being of the environment, including river habitats. It's all linked. The pollution and racist public policies that have been devastating the people of the South Bronx have also been destroying the environment. So addressing social injustices also addresses environmental injustices. Next slide, please. So our waterfront plan was developed through a series of community visioning sessions at which neighborhood residents shared their ideas and hopes. And so here's some pictures from community visioning sessions and a tour of the waterfront. You see that picture on the upper left corner. We do these kinds of tours on a regular basis as part of our advocacy. Next slide, please. As you can see on this map, Mott Haven and Port Morris lie on a peninsula. But what's tragic and upsetting is that there's virtually no access to the waterfront. In fact, some neighborhood residents don't even know that the water is so close. We only have one access point to the waterfront, and that's questionable of whether that's even an access point, given how dangerous it is to reach. You have to contend with a constant stream of garbage trucks to get to that point. We have a waste transfer facility that processes the entire household waste of the Bronx, and the trucks are going in and out of that facility at one of the supposed access points. So for the South Bronx, an open green space on the waterfront isn't just a matter of beautification and recreation, it's a matter of health, equity, and justice. Turning back to the map, what you see here indicated by the letters are the different sections of our waterfront plan. And as much as we would love to have it built all together, it can also be developed in phases. Next slide, please. So this map shows that our waterfront is in a level 2 flood zone. Not surprisingly, the area experienced heavy flooding and damage during Superstorm Sandy, as well as last summer as a result of Hurricane Ida. Our waterfront plan would not only create a much needed green space, it would also serve to mitigate flooding. And we see more and more flood events, so that becomes even more important for us to have some type of flood mitigation measure. Next slide, please. These next few slides show different sections of our waterfront and what sections of the waterfront that we want to develop as part of our plan. So here's a picture of the Bronx Kill, which is a narrow stretch of water that connects the Harlem River with the East River. And the Bronx Kill also has a very unique ecosystem. And we want to create a park here. It only makes sense. Next slide, please. This is what we call the Park Avenue boat launch, and we'd love to see more water-based recreation on our waterfront. Like what we have here is rare, and we don't see this often. This was just part of a day of activity that we had a few years ago, but it's rare to see kayaks or canoes on our waterfront. And this gets back to what I was saying earlier, that having waterfront green space would definitely contribute to the stewardship of the waterways and contribute to habitat enhancement. Next slide, please. This is another section of our waterfront plan. And this picture was taken after we had a beautification day where we painted this little section that you see here. But sadly, unless it's maintained on a regular basis, it deteriorates pretty quickly. So it's become an eyesore again. Next slide, please. And here are some sketches of how the site could look, the one we just looked at. And the one on the image on the left was developed by University of Pennsylvania's design students. And the one on the right was sketched by a local architect. So to wrap it up, our community desperately needs open green space on the waterfront. And we know that that would also result in habitat enhancement and restoration. And the health of our community residents and the health of community waterways as we see it are inextricably linked. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Thanks, Arif. And now we want to turn to Willis Elkins, the Executive Director of the Newtown Creek Alliance.
Great. Thanks, Ernest, and thanks, Hep, for having me. Arif, it's great being in another Zoom section with you. I feel like we're often presenting a lot of the similar issues we have on Newtown Creek in terms of having access to the waterfront and the value of addressing longstanding environmental issues, getting those addressed, getting access to the water, and the role that restoration plays in that. So, Newtown Creek is a major industrial corridor. The whole creek is about 4 miles long, and of course, it's connects to the East River right across from Manhattan. I'll sort of try to keep this brief because I know we have 5 minutes. So let's go to the next slide. So obviously, like a lot of New York, we have major transformations in terms of the land. And you can sort of see the original as it would have looked 400 years ago, surrounded by tidal salt marshes, and then within a few hundred years, radically transformed to a major industrial hub, the first kerosene factory in the country, first instance of air conditioning, major oil refineries, all sorts of industries that helped the country develop, but left a major wake of contamination here, and transformed it from a natural functioning ecosystem to an industrial canal. And we're sort of struggling with how we maintain some of this current function and try to find strategic ways to reintroduce the ecology that was so damaged and literally paved over. Okay, next slide. So sort of as Arif mentioned too, one of the big issues we have is access. It's really hard to start from anywhere in terms of building community engagement and stewardship, because for so long the creek, which is 11 miles of shoreline total, has virtually little access where people can actually get to the water and see the water. And when people are not aware that there's a natural resource in their backyard, they're not going to care for it. So for us, it's one of the primary goals is that we want to have more places where the people that are living nearby or working along the edges have opportunities to engage with it. And despite all the contamination that's happened and the ongoing pollution issues we have with things like CSO, same thing too, waste transfer stations, truck traffic, air pollution, soil contamination, et cetera, there's been huge rebounds in the quality of the water in the past 20 years. And so many people that grew up in these neighborhoods surrounding the creek have assumed it was a dead waterway, because that's the reality it had been for 100 years. But we see giant schools of fish, crabs, shorebirds, et cetera, coming back. But people need opportunities for access. So this is not uncommon. This is a street end site where you basically have to scamper down a pile of rocks and you're there at the edge surrounded by barbed wire. So this is a major issue for us is the access to begin with. Okay, next slide. Real quick, a little bit about our organization. We are primarily focused, similar as Arif, about the environmental concerns, longstanding health issues in this neighborhood, people living on top of the largest oil spill in the country, living on top of New York City's newest Superfund site, the Meeker Avenue plumes. So we want full remediation of the longstanding environmental issues that are here and that persist. That includes the Superfund process as well. In addition to that, we want to find ways to not just address human health concerns, but create more of these opportunities. This is the Newtown Creek Nature Walk, which is the first spot where there was any investment from any officials or city or state agencies to reconnect people with the water. It was built out as part of the wastewater treatment plant. And what it's created is really transformed at least this section of the creek, Greenpoint's community, the Greenpoint community's relationship to the water. There's places where we bring school groups here on a very regular basis. Kids are learning about the ecology. You can see there's shorebirds hanging out here. There's some remnants of what an intertidal shoreline actually looks like. You can go down those steps and see mussels and oysters and clams. It's really amazing. So in conjunction with the health concerns, with the educational value, obviously recreational value, we also want to maintain it as a working area. It's very important that we have places where there's accessible blue collar manufacturing jobs in the city. And it's also very efficient to move things by barge and by rail that we have infrastructure for. So for us, we want to combine these uses, and we feel like there's a lot of opportunity for this along the creek. We just need, funding and more willing partners and to be smart about it. Okay, next slide. So I talked about street ends. This is one area where we said, hey, these are really easy places we can create access. Publicly owned sites that have been used as dumping grounds for years. So these are just 3 different sites that we've been working on for, some of these for about a decade now, to go in, remove all sorts of, dumpsters and dumpsters worth of trash, replant areas, put in native species that, were once flourishing here, and create a space that these are very active spots that used to be, the dead end street where people did illicit activity. And now people that are working nearby come on their lunch break to hang out. They see that there's fish here. They appreciate the value of open space. And of course, in these dense industrial area too, the more green space is going to help combat things like urban heat island issue as well. So there's a few sites where we've sort of taken the initiative, put in a lot of hours, volunteer labor to try and transform these. And we do a lot of upkeep of these street end sites. Next slide. In addition to that, we're also trying to find innovative ways. It's obviously the conference is about restoration. So we have a lot of challenges to doing shoreline restoration because it's in, the bulkhead structures that are there because of the Superfund designation. So this is just one example where we built a dock, put in the native salt marsh grasses. It's used as basically an educational platform to show people, again, the ecology up close, and to show that these grasses that once surrounded the creek, thousands of acres, can survive here as well. This is just one of many projects, and we work very closely with LaGuardia Community College, a CUNY school that's just a block away from the creek. And so their students are literally out. This is an old photo, but we've built many more of these. The students are building them, designing them, and forming a direct relationship with the waterway. Next slide. And then of course there's visioning. So in addition to doing the sort of hands-on work where we can, it's very difficult for community members to go out and do the massive kind of remediation that we need. We can't rebuild the sewer system on our own. We can't dredge out contaminated sediments. We can't do high level, implement policy changes to mitigate things like soil contamination and air quality. But we can pave a path forward in a sense, so that when these things do advance, when we get massive reductions in combined sewer overflow, when we get a Superfund remediation implemented, we can show other ways that we can not just have a clean creek, but one that actually has a functioning ecosystem or components of that, one that actually connects people to the water. So in 2018, we worked with Riverkeeper on the Newtown Creek Vision Plan, and we went through the entire creek section by section, put together over 80 different projects. You see some of these like below the Grand Street Bridge, ways you could replace that, incorporate access, ecology, so on and so forth. Next slide. Like I said, 85 projects. The link is on our website. Definitely recommend people go check it out. Let's go to the next slide. And these are sort of sites like this, English Kills. This is the furthest reach in the creek. And this is near East Williamsburg and Bushwick, environmental justice community that has basically no public green space at all within 10 blocks of the creek. And there are thousands and thousands of people that are working here every day. There are hundreds of thousands of people that are living, within a 20-minute walk to this waterway, and it's totally fenced off. There's no access to Bushwick and East Williamsburg waterway. So we're thinking, how can we help transform this? There's an MTA and parking lot. There's massive water contamination because of CSO here, but in due time, if we address that, we'll go to the next slide, we can sort of envision, what this might look like. And I think for us, it's we're really sort of looking at, I know a lot of restoration sort of examines the scale, how many acres of salt marsh can you restore? Restoring acres on a place like Newtown Creek is going to be almost sort of impossible given the nature of it. And so we're looking at really sort of almost like quality over quantity, in a sense, that even having small access points has the ability to engage so many people in a meaningful way. And even having hundreds, of square feet of salt marsh restoration will have such significant potential on this waterway that we really feel like it's a very important investment for the city and the state to be making. And of course, the same thing that Arif mentioned as well, shoreline restoration, creating green space is not just about having space for the community to go, it's also about protecting the community as we have sea level rise, storm surge events, et cetera. Next slide. It's another project we're working on North Henry Street. This is in Greenpoint. And let's go to next slide. This is another stretch of shoreline that's all city owned. We've been looking at it for years. We started this process in 2015, community visioning sessions out on the site, working with local stakeholders, some of the businesses that are here, and the city itself, because they own the land. And we'll go to next slide. And what we came up with, oh, sorry, that got cut out. So we came up with basically a vision, and I can share the link about how to transform the city-owned area. And after many years of pushing forward on this, working very closely again with LaGuardia College and our other partners, we eventually landed an agreement with the city where we're going to be building out a portion of our plan, rebuilding the shoreline to create intertidal space, creating salt marsh habitat, and we're able to secure funding from New York State from a local environmental funding source. So, it took, I think the short of why I bring this up is that we had initial money to do the planning process that was also related to the oil spill here. We had persistent community members and partners that helped push this through. We had infrastructure as an organization to advance this. And then we had the fortune of having another, I mean, maybe not fortune is the best word, but we had another source of funding that was local for environmental projects because of ongoing pollution issues here in the neighborhood. And so, even with all that, it's still taken many, many years just to get a small patch of salt marsh and shoreline restored. And of course, we're still working on it. It's not actually there. So I think the short of it is that the lift is so tremendous. And, I think that we feel on the creek, but in other parts of the city too, areas that don't get, major attention from the city, that aren't sort of in the purview of, what the priorities are. Areas that are industrial in nature seem to sort of get the short end of the stick. And of course, areas that are in environmental justice communities are getting the short end of the stick. And it puts a lot on the communities themselves to advance this. And so I feel very strongly that we need stronger leadership at all levels of government. And we have great support from our elected leaders, but it's not enough. We have to have more so that all the shorelines around Newtown Creek are having opportunities for restoration, especially on city-owned, public-owned land. It's there's so much more work to be done. So I'll leave it at that and pass on.
Thanks, Willis. And now we'll turn to Jamie Young, who's the environmental protection project manager for New York City's Department of Parks and Recreation.
Thanks, Ernest. Yes, I acknowledge it's a mouthful. I really do appreciate, and I'm so honored to be on this panel with all of these wonderful panelists. And thank you to Rob and others who have invited me. It's been such a exciting opportunity for us to talk as a group of panelists, and I'm looking forward to this dialogue and conversation, and I'm sure it will continue after as well. So in terms of New York City Parks and what we do, our focus, of course, is on green and blue areas in New York City. And so not only do we focus, of course, on habitat enhancement, which is the primary way that this conference is convening and that we're all convening here. But of course we have landscaped areas as well. And then we also have street trees in our built environments. And I want to emphasize that and start with that because it's so important to recognize those, as oftentimes, especially in an urban area, the first exposure that someone gets to something green is your street tree on the sidewalk or your playground. And so that's our way of being able to get people outside and then ultimately get people into our forests and our wetlands and our grasslands, which we also have a wealth of in New York City. And so our focus today, my focus is talking about these multiple benefits of our parkland, but also recognizing that we are engaging with people through a lot of different avenues. One, we do it through watershed planning. We also engage through the design of our habitat restoration projects throughout that design process and also through construction and onwards. And then finally, we have a really robust stewardship program. And so it's been a real opportunity to see people and to reach people from all throughout New York City, all throughout the 5 boroughs, and engage them in our natural areas. And despite the things that we have done well, there are still so many things that we would like to explore and partner and expand on. And so I'll spend some time talking about that as well. So first, with regard to watershed planning, next slide. Oops. Well, in any case, when we're talking about watershed planning, one of the first landmark things that comes to mind most recently is the Harlem River Watershed Plan. And so we did the Harlem River Watershed Plan in 2021. And that was building on a number of different plans that we've done throughout the city, including in the Alley Pond or Alley Creek watershed, as well as the Bronx River Alliance for the Bronx River. And so the Harlem River Plan is one of the ways in which we are engaging in watershed planning and large-scale watershed planning. And so the goals, we had 4 goals with the Harlem River Watershed Plan. And one of those goals, or the goals are stormwater management, managing stormwater and restoring natural resources. But then the last 2 goals actually focus primarily or specifically on access and engagement. And we can't talk about engagement with the community in New York City without talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And so we worked to be able to expand those particular recommendations in our plan as well. And it's been exciting for us because, we partnered with a lot of different organizations to develop the plan. We formed a watershed advisory council, and it's been so great to hear from you, Ari, specifically because the South Bronx Unite recommendations, as well as the Port Morris plan, was something that was folded into our plan and something that we're highlighting. So being able to leverage each other's efforts has been really meaningful. But when we're talking about DEI recommendations, we want to expand the role of the Urban Waters Federal Partnership in the Harlem and the Bronx Rivers. We're looking at promoting green jobs, enhancing equity, and identifying and prioritizing areas based on need or based on lack of access versus oftentimes, the way city government works, honestly and unfortunately, is based on political will. So, trying to change that dynamic. And of course, looking at accessibility, not only from a physical standpoint, but holding bilingual meetings, holding online meetings, having those diverse formats so that we are able to meet people where they are as much as possible. And looking at expanding our greening, not just to our natural areas, but also to our streets. Because our streets have the opportunity to, with our street trees, they can mitigate heat island effect, or they can store stormwater. And so having many ways of using our park areas and our park resources to expand and maximize benefits. Next slide. So when we talk about engagement during design and construction, Ideally, we want to be able to select our sites through a watershed and master planning process. So if there is a master plan or watershed plan that exists for a region, we will refer to that. And that's why the plans that both Willis and Arif and I had talked about are so critical and so important. We also we developed a social assessment with Natural Areas Conservancy on a number of natural areas throughout New York City. And so are using that data where it is available, and also have adapted that social assessment to use at select parks that have complex uses. So these are on-site interviews and observations in our parks to inform our design. And then throughout the design process, we reach out to the community. We have public meetings. We share with our community boards. If there's a community event, for example, where we are able to table, that's another way that we can get information about a particular site to inform our design. And then finally, long-term, looking at stewardship from using stewardship and leveraging stewardship within our projects as part of the construction process. So maybe a portion of our project can be planted by volunteers, and that ensures some local investment for long-term sustainability of our project. Next. And then when we're talking about our stewardship program, it's so broad in terms of where we are able to focus. We have programs that are prioritizing street tree care in our natural areas. We have programs where people clear weeds or pick up trash, or they can plant trees and shrubs and wetland plants. And we also have community science programs. For example, in the Coney Island Creek watershed, we have horseshoe crab monitoring in the spring that people can participate in. And we have a super steward program, which is a program where we provide training to stewards so that they can work independently in parks that they select and have long-term investment in a site. And finally, we do have stewardship salons, which is a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service, and that's serving as a community of practice, using art and cultural knowledge and dialogue to participate in stewardship in different ways. Next. So what next? What else can parks do? What else can we partner with the people, with the organizations and entities represented on this panel to do? One of the things that we are looking forward to is, cultivating future generations of parkies, people who can work for us, recognizing that there are so many barriers to employment, especially in the environmental fields, but also thinking about how we can reduce those barriers and, for example, bringing in more students or employees through the Summer Youth Employment Program, and being able to provide paid opportunities for seasonal work. And then also engaging in partnership with agencies and other local organizations to expand recreational opportunities. I love that the slides in the last couple of presenters had on-water boating in their photos, because, well, obviously boating is on water, but on-water recreation in their photos, because that's one way that we use our waterfront that's not available to everyone, and being able to expand that is important. Assigning a value to community input. When you go to a meeting, that is an investment, and how can we recognize that investment, either by providing a stipend or providing food, or recognizing that we need to set it up so that parents can go with their children and still feel like they're welcome and can provide meaningful inputs. Building local capacity for people to get involved and be informed and provide comments on our projects. It's a skill that doesn't come naturally. It's definitely something that needs to be learned, and being able to provide some refreshment or some orientation, I think is the word I'm looking for, to that process, or changing that process to meet, again, try to meet people in the ways that they can provide input and engage. And then finally, thinking about climate change and recognizing that the people who are going to be impacted by climate change are the most vulnerable, and they do need to be at the table. And so making sure that we have those voices heard in our work.
Thanks, Jamie. So we have two more presentations. And our next speaker is Allison Fitzgerald, a scientist and an associate professor at New Jersey City University. Allison.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Sorry, I'm a little scratchy today. I almost cringe at the word scientist. I feel like so pompous because we're all scientists. Everyone is a scientist, and everyone out there looking at the world is a scientist. But I am an associate professor, and I have been working with nonprofit groups my whole career from graduate school on. And actually, that's the part of my job I love the most. I am definitely a HRE, Hudson River Estuary girl. I have been living in New Jersey my whole life, and I work mostly in New York. So I straddle the border and I see what's going on all around the estuary. And, my role now, and why I kind of give another point of reference to this panel, is really about influencing the next generation of stewards, the next generation of Arifs and Willises and Jamies and Leslies to come up and be able to fight for our estuary. A lot of times in academia and sometimes in public science, you are taught that results are the only answer, and you have to publish or perish, and you have to put forward, new ideas and new concepts constantly to stay afloat. But that's not really what's helping. That's not what's going to connect a community member to their waterway. And so I see my job as, how can I get meaningful data from this and get results that will push policy forward, but also make a difference in these communities. I want to do something that's going to help you. At New Jersey City University, NJCU, we do a lot of what's called community engaged learning, CEL, which is in a lot of colleges now. And the goal of CEL is not for me to just go out there and help you once and put it on my Instagram and make it all great. It's to really make a difference. So my question that I teach my students is, how can I help you? How can I go to my, constituents and my nonprofits that I work with and say, what can I do? What can my students do to help you? Because my students are all from this area. They're like the students at LaGuardia Community College. They're from the local area and they grew up there, and they are your constituents at your nonprofits. And so what can we do to help? You could start the slide, please. So this is actually a picture of a bunch of my students from NJCU, and also our Eco Volunteer Corp, which is the group of adult volunteers that I run through New York, New Jersey Baykeeper. I've been working with Baykeeper for, forever, since the mid 2000s when I started grad school. And we started together this group called the Eco Volunteers, which is an adult volunteer group where we get adults into the water and able to really connect with their estuary and collect data that we use then to push forward these restoration projects in the harbor. We're just finishing up a restoration project at Soundview Park now, which was a 5-year large investment. And in New Jersey, we've been working mostly with microplastics because there's no oyster restoration north of Vernon Bay. So we've been doing a lot of microplastic work and teaching school groups and adults about the role of microplastics in the water and how we can kind of collect data to help push forward management after that. Like I said, I work in New York. I've been at Soundview Park since 2006. I work in the Hackensack River. We work in Vernon Bay. And all these places are opportunities to engage with local nonprofits and connect the nonprofits to the college students and to the community. And so how can we get community members out into the water? So just for example, in this picture, there is 4 students, myself, I believe that's Danica, who used to work at for NRG with Parks, and in the white shirt is one of our volunteers who comes out with us a lot. And so it's just a great time and discussions that happen amongst all these people about what we can do to further the science in our estuary is wonderful. You can go to the next slide, please. And so students and citizens. Students are citizens, first of all, and they're concerned citizens. They're often really concerned about what's happening in their estuary. And as probably everyone on this call who does any sort of educational outreach knows, the younger students and the college students, they just want to learn. They want to get out there and help, and they have no restrictions really. They don't have jobs that they're going to, or time commitments, so they're able to help more. One of the things that I've learned as I've worked with local college students is to build this into their repertoire. So we use it as a teaching tool. We use it as a research tool. I have many students who come out and do research that are not necessarily going to become ecologists, but research is research. Like I said, science is science, and they're learning how to tackle a problem, which will help them to go on to future careers. And so I feel like the power in science is recognizing that local citizens should shape the research project, not the research project telling you what to do. As a scientist, I shouldn't come into your community and say, I really want to know what's going on with those oysters at Soundview Park, and I'm going to set up something here. No, that's not how it works. I should go into you and say, you've been working forever on Newtown Creek. How can I come in and help with one of your projects so that we can get some data that will move your project forward? And so it's really just all about finding ways to advance science while taking into account all of the social issues that are going on in the estuary and putting that in the forefront. Yeah, I think that's it. It's short and sweet.
Thank you, Allison. And now we'll turn to Leslie Craig, Supervisor of Southeast Region for the NOAA Restoration Center. Leslie.
Thanks, Ernest. This has all been super exciting to hear about, and I'll be really interested in maybe following up with folks later, because I think some of the things I'll share really are nesting nicely with the kinds of things I'm hearing from you all, and how it might work to marry up these more local and federal perspectives on how to move these priorities forward. So maybe just stepping back a little bit, I work for NOAA's Restoration Center. That's part of the Office of Habitat Conservation, and specifically I work for the Restoration Center. And we implement a number of programs at the national level, which basically means we implement projects and carry out our work in real places, the kinds of places that you all are talking about. We have a number of programs that have already been somewhat alluded to here. Are some grant funding programs. Historically, the community-based restoration program. More recently, IIJA funding. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has provided us some funding that we've also put out for competitive funding, and I'll talk more about that. As well as our NRDA program that Will has referred to a few times in regard to oil spill, Superfund sites, and restoration planning and implementation following those kinds of incidents. And we're taking active steps in our programs to improve how community considerations are incorporated into how we implement these programs, how we engage with communities, how we make funding decisions, and ultimately how and where we implement projects. And it's not just, when I say we, I'm saying that in a collective way. It's not necessarily NOAA coming in and implementing the project. It may be funding provided by NOAA that is provided to communities to do so. I think for the purposes of this discussion, there was interest in primarily hearing about our grant funding opportunities. So I'll kind of narrow my focus there and not speak so much about the NRDA at this point. And specifically through IIJA, we had 4 funding opportunities available over the course of the past year. The bad news is they all closed in FY22 or in 2022. They will reopen. It's a total of 5 years of funding available. So We hope that they'll reopen with some learning having happened. So whether they'll look exactly like I'm going to describe they looked in 2022, we'll see. But I think it should provide some framework for people to provide some feedback on what worked, what didn't work, what people would like to see in future years. So I guess more specifically, how did we strive to incorporate community concerns, to strive for some consistency with Justice 40 goals, some of the recent executive orders from the Biden administration focused on environmental justice. So I'll just touch on a few of the things we've done there. So all 4 of the funding opportunities included a definition and an objective to better serve underserved communities. And we used, executive order language to describe that, which is pretty broad, referring to populations sharing a particular characteristic, as well as geographic communities, which have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life. So pretty broad, and then asking applicants to describe what that means for where they live, for the communities they represent. How do they see themselves reflected in that particular definition? We asked applicants to identify if the project is located within tribal or underserved communities, and or whether a portion of the resilience benefits from the proposed work will flow to tribal or underserved communities. And in that regard, we also made a major, I'll say a deference to the applicant to describe their outreach and engagement activities. So there are evaluation criteria that we have to apply. And we essentially said, tell us what that looks like. Tell us what it is that your community needs, and then how your activities will meet the needs of that community. So essentially what the outcome of that looks like is that the evaluation criteria targeting those kinds of aspects became more heavily weighted. And each of the 4 funding opportunities included evaluation criteria focused on outreach and education, and with that deference in that regard. Maybe I'll take a quick step back. The 4 funding opportunities, to be more specific, one was focused on fish passage, and it had about a $65 million available. Think dam removals, fish passage around major river obstructions, that kind of work. Tribal fish passage had about $12 million available. Similar types of work perhaps, but focused on benefits articulated and identified for tribal communities, and only federally designated tribes and their consortia were eligible applicants for that particular funding opportunity. There was $85 million available for transformational habitat restoration and resilience, again, with a focus on benefiting underserved communities, and $10 million specifically focused on restoration and resilience for underserved communities. And so for that specific, for the tribal fish passage and the underserved communities, which were the 2 of those funding opportunities, we also had indicated an interest in understanding traditional ecological knowledge, what that means to a tribe, for instance, and how that should be applied to how we were evaluating proposals that were submitted for funding. So again, a lot of asking applicants, tell us what this means to you, so that we can then evaluate it based on that rationale, essentially, as opposed to just our own rationale of what we think it should mean. For the habitat restoration funding to benefit underserved communities, I was just going to read, actually, I printed it out because I think it captures it pretty well, the principal objective for that particular solicitation. It was to support opportunities for underserved communities, tribes, and or tribal entities to meaningfully engage in coastal habitat restoration activities. The funding was intended to support capacity building as well as restoration projects and their associated activities. So we tried not to just, have it be, oh, go implement a project and tell us about the E&D. tell us about the project more broadly. You could be at a very early conceptualization stage, for instance. And of course, we're interested in those that have a potential to lead to habitat restoration in estuarine, coastal, marine, and Great Lakes environments. And then even more specifically, maybe at a deeper level, really interested in meaningful engagement of underserved communities in this work. Our intention is to ensure that communities are integral to the visioning and decision-making and leadership for coastal habitat restoration projects, to ensure that the scope of the project is inclusive of the priorities and needs articulated by that community, and to ultimately ensure that the benefits flow back to the community. And I'll be honest, this is all a work in progress, a learning step for us to figure out, how do we do that? What does that look like, especially in context of a competitive solicitation? But as far as the mindset and what I hope came through in the articulation of the funding opportunities, this was really intended to kind of step us outside of our own kind of technical expertise around coastal fisheries habitat, this comfort zone that we have in leading and implementing those kinds of projects, and to really ask communities to tell us what their community ecological and resilience needs are. We took a step back, as I said, from prioritizing funding on the ground habitat restoration, and even asked communities to tell us about what their capacity needs are. What do they need to even think about that? To even start to envision what that could look like in their communities. And then I just wanted to underscore the meaningful engagement aspect. I think this is maybe one of our biggest learning areas, even though that is an articulated objective. Still figuring out what that looks like. How do we know? What are some things that we should be looking for in these proposals to determine if a proposal is actually moving in that direction. And then I think the last thing that I'll underscore is that while I said we're stepping outside of our comfort zone, we also are and still remain a technical assistance program. So we have staff all around the country who are experts at implementing habitat restoration projects. And why I wanted to underscore that is that these are resources that are available to connect with communities, to help identify what opportunities might exist that maybe weren't being seen. Maybe needs articulated by a community could align with some of the expertise that folks in the Restoration Center could, marry up and help to support advancement of some habitat restoration. So I don't want to lose the heart and soul of what it is that we do, but put it out there as a resource that I think could be tapped into with maybe a different perspective on how to do so. And I think I'll pause there.
Great, thank you so much, Leslie. So the first question I want to pose is really both for Arif and Willis. Both of you were very clear on listing what I would call cumulative impact. Arif, you talked about things like finding the impact of PM 2.5, cognitive impact, presence in the brain and the liver, and Ellis, and talking about Newtown Creek. You were just laying out all the things that are assaults on public health and everyday life there. So I'd like both of you, if you could, to address, if you were to go to specific agencies and scientists and funders, what is it that you need now to make progress on your agenda for the waterfront? Who wants to go first?
Sure, I can start. More than anything else, funding. So Leslie, it was good to hear from you and potential funding opportunities. I think what we would want to see is that there is an understanding that that habitat restoration and community health are both considered, and that when funds are available for habitat restoration or habitat enhancement, that the community adjacent to those habitats are equally prioritized. And I think that's, I heard that from you. So, very encouraged by that. But, we have this plan, and the plan was prioritized by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in 2014. That unfortunately did not translate into any funding or any additional support for the plan. We worked on the plan with architects, landscape architects, design schools. So it's a well thought out plan. It's a plan that was led by our community. And so we have that community support as well. What we lack more than anything else is political will, a prioritization of the plan by our, by public policymakers, and then funding for it. So we received a few years back, we received about $3 million from New York City Council, but that money has been held up by the agency that is responsible for that funding, with the claim that until we raise the money for the additional money for that particular phase of the project, that they're not going to release the money. And their assessment for how much money is needed for that particular phase of the project is double that of what was assessed by a world-renowned landscape architecture firm that we're working with. So, in short, I would say funding and political will is what we need most.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to follow up on that, we've had a lot of issues where we need real buy-in from agencies that have the power to implement real change along, in particular talking about restoration and access along the creek. And just two quick examples, we had a street insight in Queens and Long Island City that the community for 20 years had put together multiple plans as to how to transform the street into a small little park that someone could go and walk down to the water or launch a boat, including one that was involved city planning 20 years ago. And then after the bulkhead collapsed because of years and years of neglect from the city DOT's plan and EDC's plan had absolutely none of the elements the community had been asking for 20 years. And so this was a point where the city was investing money to rebuild this because the shoreline was now a liability because it had fallen into the creek. And there was no real true leadership or interest in finding ways to implement, things the community and the city had been asking for 20 years. They said, well, we got to fix it right away. And we're just going to put up a giant concrete wall and riprap on the other side. And so major lost opportunity. That's not going to, to redo that work is going to be, in many ways more difficult. There was another site that was owned by New York City DEP further back in the creek that was required per the city to have public access along the waterfront because it was a change of use. And they went to the mayor's office and got an override for what was required by the city itself to provide public access to the waterfront. Because again, these areas are not seen as priorities. And they said, well, it's back in an industrial zone and whatever. So, there's obviously the funding, but there's also like the larger will of the agencies there's only so much we can do on the community side to actually implement this stuff. There has to be real buy-in. And so time and time again, we see these opportunities sort of coming by where it's a city owned or, parcel, and there's opportunity, and it's not, there's no real, sense of, whatever commitment at the higher levels for that.
And again, to the two of you, obviously dealing with the individual agencies as a tall order. But I also wonder, looking at the two geographies, Port Morris and Mott Haven, and then looking at Newtown Creek, are there also private landowners that you want to convince to open up more shoreline space and habitat space to the communities you serve? And how is that going? Arif, you go first, or Ellis?
Yeah, Arif, go for it.
Go ahead, Willis.
Okay, well, yes, absolutely. There's a lot, and that's a lot of stuff in the vision plan as well. And we actually have a site visit later today with a large property owner to sort of talk about that, because that is so much of the shore is privately owned. And the issue is that, again, there's not a lot of incentive for private property owners to do things like restoration along their shoreline. So that's an opportunity where we need more sort of help from partners like NOAA to say, like, there's funding, and we have the Superfund cleanup and the natural resources damagement process that's happening. So in some cases there's going to be property owners that are say, yeah, sure, we're not using our shoreline, we're not opposed to it, but it's a major lift for them to do all the investment. And I think the other thing too is about liability, is that there's a lot of opportunity to reclaim a lot of the waterfront space from private parcels that are currently not using it and have no plans of using in the future, and saying, is there a way we can maybe transfer this land to like an agency like Parks, where they can oversee that strip of shoreline, improve the ecology, create public access. There's so many opportunities for that, but again, there's no real incentive, and there's no real mechanism to make that happen. When there's a change of land use, if all our industrial sites on the creek were rezoned to residential, which is not what we want, then there would be public access as part of that. So we're trying to find ways and work with city planning and city government to have mechanisms so that we can, in a sense, reclaim some of this waterfront and have it serve the ecology and the public good, as opposed to just being, the back end of a parking lot.
Arif, anything you want to add, or is that?
Yeah, in our case, and what adds insult to injury is that land that we are looking to transform into an open green space on the waterfront is public land. That's New York State DOT land. And during the first Governor Cuomo, Mario Cuomo, he leased that land to a private developer for 99 years. And what they did in turn was sublease that land to last mile warehouses, waste management, all sorts of polluting facilities. So our public land is being used to further pollute our community, and a for-profit company is reaping enormous profit by subleasing that public land to these types of polluting facilities. So it's just really tragic. And so for us, we want to be able to use public land for the public good. Where there are maybe some small slices of the land that the who owns that is unclear. We've also been in conversation with the subleasers, some of the subleasers, including Waste Management. They want to be a good partner, and in fact, there's a parcel of land that it's on their property, or the property that they're subleasing, that they would love to see transformed into an accessible green space, but it's not even up to them, and we don't have funding for to be able to do that. So that's what our situation is.
So if you had funding, do you have a pathway for finding how to deal with this 99-year lease, or if you had a?
Yeah, we've been in some conversations with the New York State DOT, which has been very mysterious as well, in terms of being forthcoming with information, but I think that if we had some funding behind us, and some more support from the New York State DEC, for example, and to their credit, Commissioner Sagos actually came out to the waterfront and met with us and expressed his desire to support us. So we had that kind of support, and we kind of are on the cusp of that. I think it makes our case with the DOT stronger.
Thanks, Arif. So Jamie, that brings me to you. I mean, I think all of us, and I would assume folks in the audience agree, that Parks and Recreation is one of the greener agencies of the city of New York, and in that spirit, New York has something like you know the number better than I, but 440 plus miles of shoreland. That's a lot of potential habitat. Does Parks and Recreation have a sense of how much of that shoreline and the associated habitat can go from hard edge to green edge in the next 10, 20 years? Jamie?
Yeah, yes, thanks. I would say that it's certainly a partnership with New York City Parks as well as other agencies and in terms of looking at that shoreline, because not all of that shoreline is owned by parks. It's other public
Right.
properties as well as private properties. And so there is the New York City Planning has put out the waterfront vision, comprehensive waterfront plan, I'm sorry. And that has a good sense in terms of the shoreline, in terms of mapping and considering the different uses. And we worked very closely with them to develop recommendations for access to the waterfront and also looking at areas where we can soften the edge. And then there's also probably other panels, including the one coming after this, that will focus more on those types of efforts.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Allison, I was pleased to sort of hear you emphasize the importance of citizen science and community science. And I'm wondering whether you could talk about what steps can we take to leverage community science? When can we make it actually actionable science, data that can be used by agencies, used in court?
That's actually a great question and something we've been fighting for years because, a lot of the agencies statewide and national have different rules for when it comes to accepting citizen science data and community data. Everyone on here has known about a QUAP and having to have everything kind of quality checked. But even with doing that, they're hesitant to take citizen data. And so the good thing about partnering a citizen group with a academic institution is that you can kind of leverage the academic institution's name, I guess would be a way of saying it, or moniker, and you can use them to help to get the data to the appropriate agencies. It's a battle that we've been fighting from a nonprofit standpoint for a long time to figure out, what can we do to get our data used? What steps, we'll follow all the steps you want us to follow. We'll do whatever you want us to do. We'll put it in whatever portal, but how can we get that data out there? And so what I would say is work on making your method solid, so that you have a solid methodology you're following every time. Keep accurate records of all your data. Make sure your citizen scientists are trained well. And then reach out to whatever organization you want to share this data with to make sure that you're following all the steps that they need you to. And even if they say, like, we can't accept this data, that doesn't mean it's not useful. It can still be presented as what we call like a white paper or a technical paper to New York City Parks, to the board of directors of your local charity, to anybody, to show that, hey, we've been paying attention to this. We've been down at the waterfront every day and we've been looking at this problem and cataloging it and taking data on it. And, a lot of this information, especially when you have year-long surveys, years and years and years. I always like talking to, I always say the old fishermen I meet out on the water, they have the best stories, but that story is data. They'll tell me about all the crabs they caught 25 years ago. And I'm like, oh, okay, so there were crabs here 25 years ago. Knowing this long-term data, it shows us the trends and it shows us it's more data is just ammunition. It's words. It's things that you can take to an agency and say, look, this is what's happening. And so it's power. And being able to collect that in an organized, orderly way over time is going to increase the usage of your data.
Thank you. Leslie, I was quite taken with your reference to your office, and I would assume more broadly, trying to get beyond your comfort zone. So could you, based on what you've heard from Willis and Arif, could you talk about kind of the technical support that you think you might be able to provide them as they, Arif is struggling with 99-year lease, right? If he's kind of want more access, and Willis talked about kind of the, I guess, the upper reach of Newtown Creek, English Kill. Would your program be able to help them with that?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't say we can or can't, but what I can tell you is that we do have technical experts that I'm guessing you all have interacted with to some degree or other. My counterpart, for instance, in the Northeast is John Patina with the NOAA Restoration Center. I think one of his staff folks that is a little more proximate to you all is Carl Alderson. So just throwing those names out as folks that you probably have already crossed paths with. And as examples of people that I will say for the Restoration Center, but probably NOAA more broadly, people are we have a lot of experience. We've been doing this for a really long time. And so we've seen a lot of different examples. We've learned to be very creative and innovative, and we can bring forward those examples that maybe have happened in other areas to say, might this be an option here? Or could we work from this type of concept and apply it here? Or might there be some components that we would borrow from other places that we've worked to see if it could help to solve a problem in this particular example? So while our expertise is absolutely habitat for fisheries and endangered species, our experience is actually much more broad than that. We do have, depending on the individual, especially because we work in the NRDA lane as well, a lot of legal experience, a lot of partnering experience, a lot of creative and innovative engineering and application experience, a lot of different things that, because we're also working as a national program, those folks that are working more locally may have just been on a seminar with their colleagues from the West Coast that are approaching a very similar problem in a new and innovative way that they might be able to bring forward, to New York, New Jersey, harbor type of area. So I wouldn't, even though our comfort zone is that more kind of technical, let's say biological, that is why we were hired in many regards. That's certainly not, our experience is much more broad than that and much more innovative.
And while the fiscal 2022 round closed, there'll be obviously another round opening. And I'm wondering whether that round includes money to actually, in order to get sort of authentic, broad-based, deep community input, whether that's going to encompass stipends for people who need babysitters, for people who are trying to take off from work to attend visioning and planning for projects.
So we saw that as we're currently evaluating all of these proposals. There are no funding decisions made, even though those funding opportunities have closed. And we have seen that particular strategy be proposed in many of the applications that we received. And I think it's from other examples that I've seen outside of the actual applications. I think those are great strategies. They seem to be very place-based. Every location, every proposal describe why that was a need in their particular area and what it might help them achieve. And it was not an uncommon strategy to be proposed, and certainly one that's allowable within the funding available through those competitive opportunities.
So NOAA has gotten comfortable with essentially helping to subsidize people so that they can get this. And you look around the regions of NOAA, and that's all happening. That's like it.
Right. So what I'm speaking to is specifically related to the competitive funding opportunities, where people could articulate in their proposal, how can they better build capacity? How can they better engage their underserved community? How can they better achieve meaningful engagement to advance habitat restoration and resilience? And so if an applicant perhaps somebody on the screen had proposed that as a strategy, it's perfectly viable and allowable.
And Jamie, from the city's perspective, is the city going to be helping to subsidize engagement by people in communities of projects?
Yeah, I can't speak on that on behalf of the agency. I don't know, but we can certainly, find out. I think when it comes to the projects that we are applying for in my unit in particular with our and probably other units around within New York City Parks, if there is grant funding, that's something that we are working. If we are pursuing grant funding, that's something that we are working more to include in our projects too. So it's great to hear from Leslie that it's been received well from other applications. We'll continue to prioritize.
Great, thank you. And now I want to give our 5 panelists a chance to ask a question of another panelist. Who wants to go first? You don't have to have questions for your fellow panelists, but if you do, now is the time to.
I have one that I'd welcome input if none other are jumping at the opportunity.
Go for it.
Okay. Well, I don't think it'll be a surprise. It's a carry on from what I've been speaking to. So, as I said, one of our objectives is for projects to meaningfully engage underserved communities. But keep in mind that these are competitive funding opportunities, and we review the proposals based on the words that are on paper. So I'm curious your thoughts on what should we be looking for, maybe as articulated activities that you think would really actually be indicative of meaningful engagement, that it's happening and that it'll be sustained. What would success look like in that regard, in terms of something that we should evaluate again in a written proposal, which is not the most meaningful way to figure this out.
Fareed, tell us.
Yeah, I can weigh in a little bit on that. Thanks, Leslie, for that question. I think first, seeing who that effort is being driven by, right? And if it is resident driven, then I think that holds a lot of weight. These are folks who are immediately impacted by the issues that they are trying to address in their community. So I think that's a very important criterion. I would also say, seeing what types of activities they've done. There's a track record of stewardship or in like visioning sessions, and I'm speaking about some of what we've done, of course, but and kind of speaking to our group because it is a resident driven organization, and we have done these types of community visioning sessions. But I would say that that's something that should be common or the norm for organizations in general. So those are some of the things that come to mind in terms of what to look for, just track record as well as resident driven.
Yeah. I would just add to that real quick too. We're in a sort of interesting situation because we don't have a lot of residents that are right near the creek. And so some of our biggest stakeholders are sometimes local businesses, but other also institutions. I mentioned LaGuardia Community College, and in Jamie's slide, actually, one of the park rangers, Harry, was a LaGuardia student and worked with us on the creek for probably 2 summers through an internship with LaGuardia, and so got a lot of hands-on experience doing stuff directly on the creek. And it's great to see what he's doing now with parks as a steward. But it's also, it's another reason why, we don't have we have very little to no park space around the creek for that sort of programming engagement to happen. So I think just to answer the question, that there's stakeholders can be a sort of variety of group, and sometimes it's hard to quantify. It's hard to sort of quantify a more passive working group that's spending a lot of time near the creek, or even a college where you have students that are only spending a few years there in the case of LaGuardia, and then moving on to other stuff. So I think, I think sort of having an open mind about the differences between different sort of areas and what comprises a stakeholder is important as well. But I agree with Arif too about sort of track record of organizations and partners.
Right, right.
That's such a good point, Willis. I mean, every context is different, and I think that when we employ criteria, there has to be flexibility, yeah, just wanted to agree on that.
So we have, as one would expect, questions from our audience. One question is, have there been some high-profile conflicts around climate adaptation of well-resourced New York City shorelines? If funders, agencies, and planners listen more to marginalized communities, should they expect a different set of issues around adaptation and restoration in EJ communities? What might that look like? Who wants to catch that one? Jamie?
I've been talking a lot, so I'm just gonna, sit back for a little bit.
Jamie Ellis?
Yeah, I'm still, I'm a visual person, so I have to read this question also.
Allison?
I mean, I do think, yes, of course, right? And I think that's where the question is coming from in terms of, yes, there have been high profile conflicts regarding adaptation and shorelines, and listening to marginalized communities is critically important. I think, should they expect a different set of issues? It's so broad. I think a lot of what we've been talking about as a panel is that a lot of these issues are incredibly place-based. So it's a little difficult for me to answer the question, except to say, of course we want to listen. Of course we want to recognize that there are issues related to adaptation and restoration, and listening to environmental justice and diverse perspectives is important. But every community is going to have an individual need, and I guess it's just going to take a lot more listening to be able to craft a solution that is going to take those perspectives into account.
Allison, as the Baykeeper, do you have a sense on this question?
Honestly, this is a super complex question that I do not feel qualified to answer. I will say, just as an outsider looking in with a lot of experience working with nonprofits over the past years, it's so political, this stuff. And even if you had a meeting with your community, you're going to get 10 different answers from the community about what they feel is the most important issue. And then you're going to take those 10 issues to the government, and they're going to say, well, we don't think 5 of those are good. We think, so like I hate to be like Debbie Downer, but I don't think it would change. And that's a personal opinion that is not backed by any educational, qualifications at all. That's just my personal feeling, is that I don't think that it would end up changing, but I also don't think that means we should stop fighting for it to change.
Right. Arif,
Yes, sorry, just to add to that a little, and to respond to that a little bit more. You know, one of the things I really loved about what you said, Arif, was that environmental justice, no, addressing social injustices also address environmental injustice, right? So the last part of this question is suggesting that funding for housing and public health should be associated with restoration. And, you know, I think that gets to that point of how all of these issues are ultimately integrated and we need to come up with holistic solutions.
This next question is directed to Arif. During the community outreach, did your team experience any pushback from residents about the waterfront plan? What were the biggest concerns with the implementation of the waterfront plan? How are your park plans tackling the issue of sea level rise and flooding mitigation?
There was no pushback, in short, because it was a community-driven, resident-driven effort. So the folks who led the visioning or who organized the visioning were community members themselves. And so that's a great, I think, benefit that we have at South Bronx Unite, the resident-driven part of it. And there hasn't been any pushback on the plan itself because it was again conceived of and developed by community members. What was the other part of the question, Ernest?
Just a second. Let me scroll back to it.
Okay.
Oh, what are the biggest concerns with the implementation of the waterfront plan? And how are your park plans tackling the issue of sea level rise and flooding mitigation?
I mean, there aren't any concerns from our part. I mean, there may be concerns from other parties, including state agencies, and maybe the implication of that New York State DOT land. I don't see how or why there would be. I mean, any improvement of that land would benefit. I think the New York State DOT as well as it would just that land which is now just lying there, and in fact, the bulkheads are crumbling, would be better maintained with an open green space. In terms of flood protection, also, I mean, it really creates some measure of flood mitigation for our community, where right now none exists, and it's not the I think only measure that we would want to protect the community against extreme weather events and specifically flooding, but it is I think a significant enough measure and provides some level of protection, and so right now I think the only thing that's holding us back is sort of like what I had mentioned earlier, political will and agency support and funding.
Thank you. Two more questions I want to get to before our time is up. This is a question for Jamie. Does Parks have a partnership framework for facilitating community-driven coastal restoration access on park shorelines? What are the barriers for community members to implement grassroots restoration on parks shorelines? That's one question. That's for Jamie. And then the other one was, which I think Arif or Willis could perhaps address, how are and how will fish consumption advisories be included in habitat enhancement and public access projects? So Jamie, you first.
Sure. So yes, I'm so glad that this question was asked, because we do have a framework for managing our wetland areas, and that's called the Wetlands Management Framework. And I can provide the link for that in the HOVA chat, or if you just search Wetlands Management Framework for New York City, it should come up. And it's a 30-year plan to consider our wetland areas, streams, salt marshes, freshwater wetlands, and to recognize the need for protection and prioritize sites that do need protection and restoration, and also assigning a cost to what that would look like. And providing recommendations for how to overcome financial barriers like the need for cost as well as other barriers. And so barriers for community members to implement grassroots restoration. The plan covers that on some level. I would say a major barrier is education as well, or just exposure. I mean, I think a lot of times our wetlands, we have wetland stewardship projects, and they often take an intrepid sort of volunteer to go out into our wetlands and get a little dirty and get a little bit muddy and be comfortable with being near the water or in the water to get out there. And it's unfortunate that so many people in New York City don't have an exposure to that, or maybe might see it as a negative experience versus a positive one. And so we want to be able, and that's why stewardship is so important. We want to be able to indicate that this is a really valuable opportunity to expand your comfort zone, for example, and also to provide a really meaningful input to your local community.
And Willis and Anna-Reeve, very quickly, the question from the audience was about the incorporation of fish consumption advisories into habitat enhancement and public access projects.
Sure. Yeah. Newtown Creek is a federal Superfund site. We worked very closely with EPA a few years ago to design specific signage for Newtown Creek that warns against the dangers of fish and shellfish consumption on the creek, and it's in 5 different languages, and it got posted at basically every formal and informal, because there's lots of informal access points around the creek. So for us, that was a major step forward, because we want people to have access, but obviously there's a huge part of that is education and people being well informed of what the conditions of the creek are. So that's something we'll expand as more sites come online is education.
Yeah, just briefly, we're fortunate to not be a Superfund site, and there are people who occasionally go fishing on the waterfront, and once we get to that point, we would definitely work with the appropriate agencies and authorities to make sure that there's accurate information on the wildlife, and including fish in those waterways, to make sure that people have adequate information.
And just briefly, do you think most people in the communities you serve understand the health risks, or is there a certain amount of subsistence fishing anyway?
No, not subsistence fishing. I mean, there are some people who are fishing, but very, very, very few. And so it's not.
Catch and release.
What's that?
So catch and release.
I think that people are actually catching and consuming. But I actually don't know enough about the health implications of that in our waterways. It may actually be okay, but I think once we get to that point, we would do the appropriate research or work with the appropriate authorities and agencies to do that research and make sure that people have the information they need to determine whether it is safe for them to consume.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've reached, it's 12:32, we reached the end of this session. I want to thank all of our panelists for their presentations today and their answers to the questions. And obviously we have a lot of exciting work ahead. Thank you very much.
Well, let me
Thank
just
you.
echo that, and thank you, Ernest, for taking the time to moderate this panel. I thought it was a great discussion, a lot of great information that we're certainly going to incorporate on our upcoming RFPs that Lisa mentioned, that we'll be issuing sometime in January. So a lot of great lessons and learning. So our next session is at 1 p.m. It's we have another great panel looking back at the last 20 years of restoration experience. And now that we have sort of results from some of these long-term projects, or we have results from projects that have been in the ground for a long time, I guess I should say. So anyway, stay tuned, and that'll be on at 1 p.m. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.